The Kronos loomed in the launch chamber, a sleek vessel of shimmering alloys that caught the sterile light like a blade poised to strike. It was the culmination of decades of research, a testament to humanity's audacious desire to master time itself. Dr. Alara Kane stood at the foot of the ramp, her heart pounding in rhythm with the low hum of the ship's idling systems. Around her, the team moved with precision, their excitement barely masking the anxiety that coiled in the air like a living thing. "Final checks," Malik Voss called, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. He brushed a hand over the console embedded in the ship's hull, his fingertips dancing across glowing displays. "If this works, we'll be legends. If it doesn't..." He trailed off, letting the unsaid consequence linger. "We'll make it back," Captain Owen Rhett interjected, his tone firm. His broad shoulders were squared in the manner of someone who had faced uncertainty before, though the faint twitch in his jaw betrayed the effort it took to maintain composure. He glanced at Kara Lynn, who was inspecting the crystalline matrices of the navigation system, her youthful face alight with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. "It's not the leap that worries me," Kara admitted, her voice soft. "It's what's waiting on the other side." Ilara tightened her grip on her datapad. As the team's biologist, she had spearheaded the mission's theoretical groundwork, projecting humanity's potential evolutionary pathways 10,000 years into the future. Her predictions painted a picture of resilience and innovation, but the unknown variables gnawed at her. How much could the Earth and humanity change in 10 millennia? The countdown commenced, an automated voice echoing through the chamber. 10 minutes to temporal displacement. "Let's get on board," Alara said, forcing her voice to steady. "No turning back now." Inside the Kronos, the crew settled into their stations. The cabin was tight, its walls bristling with intricate panels and blinking displays. Ilara strapped into her seat beside the central console, her pulse quickening as the countdown progressed. The temporal drive thrummed beneath their feet, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to pulse in harmony with her rising anxiety. "Engaging stabilization fields," Kara announced, her hands deftly manipulating the controls. A faint shimmer enveloped the cabin, bending light at its edges. Ilara felt a fleeting pressure behind her eyes, like the onset of a migraine. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to focus. "Destination locked," Malik confirmed. "Earth, 10,000 years from this exact date. Coordinates stable." The final seconds ticked away. The ship's interior dimmed, the lights replaced by a kaleidoscope of shifting colors that danced across the walls. Ilara gripped the armrests as the countdown reached 0. The leap was immediate and violent. The Kronos jolted as if yanked through an unseen vortex. The cabin warped around them, the walls folding inward and outward in impossible patterns. Ilara's vision blurred. She caught fragmented glimpses of the world outside, streaks of light and shadow, a whirl of land masses shifting and contorting. It was as though she was witnessing the planet's history collapse and reform in a single heartbeat. Her stomach lurched, and the pressure behind her eyes became unbearable. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Kara cry out, followed by Malik swearing under his breath. Captain Rhett's voice cut through the cacophony, barking commands to hold steady. Then, as abruptly as it began, the turbulence ceased. The ship landed with a jarring thud. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the ragged breathing of the crew. The cabin lights flickered back to life, illuminating faces pale with shock. "Status report," Rhett ordered, his voice sharp despite the tremor in it. Kara checked her instruments, her hands trembling. "We're here, 10,000 years into the future. Temporal coordinates match exactly." Ilara unbuckled her harness and rose unsteadily, her legs feeling like rubber beneath her. Through the ship's viewport, she glimpsed a landscape bathed in an eerie, golden light. Towering spires jutted from the ground, their surfaces gleaming with an organic sheen. The air shimmered with heat, or perhaps something else entirely. The Earth was both familiar and utterly alien. "We should run diagnostics before we step outside," Malik said, his voice tight. Rhett shook his head. "No time. We need to assess the environment firsthand." He turned to Ilara. "You're the biologist. What do you see?" Ilara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the strange structures beyond the glass. The terrain was lush, teeming with vegetation unlike anything she had seen before. Trees with tendrils instead of branches swayed unnaturally, and a faint bioluminescent glow emanated from the underbrush. "It's alive," she whispered. "Everything out there. It's alive." The words hung heavy in the air. Rhett nodded grimly. "Suit up. We're going outside." The team donned their environmental suits, their movements mechanical with dread. As the Kronos' hatch opened, a wave of humid air flooded the cabin, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made Ilara's stomach churn. The first step onto the transformed Earth was tentative. Ilara crouched to examine the soil, which was spongy underfoot and seemed to pulse faintly, as though it had a heartbeat. Kara scanned the surroundings with her equipment, frowning at the readings. "This doesn't make sense," Kara murmured. "The atmosphere is oxygen-rich, but it's filled with trace compounds I can't identify." "Stay close," Rhett ordered, his hand hovering near the weapon strapped to his side. "No one wanders off." They moved cautiously, their suits' sensors crackling with feedback. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle from the alien vegetation. The landscape stretched endlessly, a surreal mix of beauty and dread. Ilara stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. Ahead of them, partially buried in the ground, was a structure, or what remained of one. It was unmistakably human in origin, its metal framework corroded and warped beyond recognition. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. "We weren't the first," Malik muttered, his voice barely audible. Ilara knelt beside the ruins, running her gloved fingers over the surface. Strange markings covered the metal, etched deeply as if by claws. She felt the air shift around her, a subtle disturbance that sent a chill racing down her spine. "Something's watching us," she said, barely above a whisper. Rhett's hand tightened on his weapon, his eyes scanning the shadows. The golden light seemed to dim, and the oppressive silence deepened. Whatever awaited them in this future, Ilara realized, it had been waiting a long time. The sun, or what they assumed was the sun, hung low in the alien sky, its golden light casting elongated shadows that twisted unnaturally across the landscape. The team fanned out cautiously, their suits amplifying their shallow breaths and the occasional crackle of static from their comms. Every step was tentative, the spongy ground giving underfoot like flesh, releasing faint puffs of mist that smelled faintly metallic. Ilara felt the weight of the silence pressing on her, broken only by Kara's murmured readings. "The atmosphere's breathable," Kara reported, though her voice wavered. "But there's something wrong. These compounds aren't natural. They're reactive, organic. Almost like..." "Like what?" Rhett prompted sharply. "Like the planet is alive," she finished, not meeting his eyes. The observation lingered in the air as they approached a rise in the landscape. Beyond it, the alien skyline stretched endlessly. The towering structures they had seen from the ship were more defined now, vast organic spires covered in sinewy, translucent layers that pulsed faintly. Vines, or something resembling vines, coiled around their bases, glistening with an ichor-like substance. "It's not architecture," Malik muttered, staring up at one of the spires. "It's biology. Grown, not built." Ilara crouched near one of the coiling plants, her gloved hand hovering over its surface. The texture was waxy and warm to the touch, and it quivered as if aware of her presence. She recoiled instinctively, her heart pounding. "Keep moving," Rhett ordered. "We stick to the mission. Record, observe, but no unnecessary risks." They pressed on, descending into a shallow valley that was even more unsettling than the rise. The vegetation here was denser, taller, and stranger. Trees with gelatinous trunks dripped luminescent sap, and wide-leafed plants unfurled as they passed, exposing inner surfaces studded with what looked like sensory nodes. Ilara had to force herself not to imagine that they were being watched, not by eyes, but by the environment itself. It wasn't long before they found the first signs of what had become of humanity. The discovery came in the form of a structure, partially collapsed and coated in the same bioorganic material that dominated the landscape. At first glance, it seemed like a relic of the past, angular metal beams protruding from a mound of overgrowth. But as they drew closer, it became clear this was no ordinary ruin. The walls were studded with what looked like sculptures of human figures. They were contorted in grotesque poses, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish. Kara gasped, her scanner trembling in her hand. "These aren't sculptures," she said, her voice breaking. "These were people." Ilara approached cautiously, her stomach knotting as she inspected the closest figure. Its surface glistened with a membrane that was disturbingly lifelike, and faint ridges hinted at veins beneath. The scanner in her suit beeped erratically as she held it over the figure. "It's human DNA," she confirmed, though her voice was hollow. "Or it was. There's something else now, something fused with it." Malik turned away, muttering curses under his breath. Rhett's jaw tightened as he surveyed the grotesque tableau. "We need answers," he said. "Keep moving. There might be more inside." Inside the ruined structure, the air was heavy and damp. The walls pulsed faintly, and the faint vibration beneath their feet grew stronger. Ilara tried to focus on her scanner, but the rhythmic thrum was making her vision swim. She could feel it in her chest, in her teeth, as if it were trying to synchronize with her heartbeat. They found what might have been a control room. Its panels were warped, fused with the same organic material that coated the exterior. Screens flickered with distorted images, fragments of faces, warped landscapes, and symbols that defied comprehension. Malik tried to interface with one of the panels, but it hissed at his touch, retracting like a living thing. "This isn't technology," he said through gritted teeth. "It's something else. It's evolving." A low, guttural sound echoed through the structure, freezing them in place. It wasn't a roar or a screech, but something deeper, a vibration that resonated through their bones. Elara turned slowly, her heart pounding as she scanned the shadows. "Movement," Kara whispered. "Behind us." The team spun around, their lights cutting through the murk. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place, just the pulsing walls and the alien vegetation that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the vibrations. Then Elara saw it, a shadow that was too fluid, too alien to be human. It slipped through the dim light like liquid, its form shifting and distorting as it moved. Rhett raised his weapon, but the thing was gone before he could fire. "Stay together," he commanded. "We're not alone." As they made their way back toward the entrance, the vibrations grew stronger. The walls began to shimmer, their surfaces splitting and reforming in fractal patterns that made Elara's head spin. The grotesque sculptures seemed to move in her peripheral vision, their contorted faces following her. "Faster," Rhett urged, his voice tight. "We need to get out of here." They emerged into the open air, but the landscape had changed. The towering spires seemed closer now, their pulsing surfaces glowing brighter. The vegetation had thickened, closing in around the structure like a living cage. And then Malik cried out. They turned to see him struggling with something on his arm, a slick, slug-like creature that had latched onto his suit. It pulsed and writhed, its surface glowing faintly as it burrowed through the fabric. Malik screamed, clawing at it, but it was too late. The thing disappeared beneath his skin, leaving a trail of darkened veins in its wake. "Get it off!" he shouted, his voice breaking with panic. Elara rushed to him, pulling a surgical blade from her kit. "Hold still," she said, her hands trembling as she worked to cut around the infected area. The flesh around the wound was already swelling, pulsing in time with the vibrations that filled the air. Malik's breathing was ragged as the creature was removed, but the damage was done. His arm was discolored, the veins branching out like blackened roots. He staggered, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get him back to the ship," Rhett said, his voice grim. But as they turned toward the Kronos, Elara realized with a sinking heart that the path they had come from was gone. The landscape had shifted again, and the ship was nowhere to be seen. The landscape seemed to warp and breathe around them, closing in as though the earth itself were alive and aware of their presence. The faint bioluminescence that marked their path now pulsed rhythmically, illuminating alien flora with an eerie, hypnotic cadence. Malik staggered at the rear of the group, his breaths labored and uneven. Elara kept glancing back at him, her scanner in hand, the readings fluctuating wildly. "We can't ignore this anymore," she said quietly to Rhett. "Whatever that thing did to him, it's accelerating." Rhett's gaze was hard, but there was an unspoken agreement in his silence. They couldn't turn back. There was no clear path to the Kronos, and leaving Malik behind seemed unthinkable. Yet Ilara could see the signs. His veins, now dark and swollen, spiderwebbed across his neck, and his skin had taken on a translucent quality. Every so often, he twitched violently, his body convulsing as though something inside him was trying to break free. "Just keep moving," Rhett finally said, his voice cold. "We'll find a place to stop soon." But the terrain offered no comfort. The ground grew more unstable, spongy and warm with each step. Vines thicker than tree trunks crisscrossed their path, pulsing faintly as if carrying something, fluid, energy, life, through their grotesque veins. The horizon was dominated by the towering spires they had seen from a distance, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Ilara's stomach churned. "This isn't just evolution," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "It's transformation. Something rewrote life here." Kara, who had been silent for most of the trek, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "This can't be natural. Even in 10,000 years, this level of biological integration, plants, animals, the planet itself, it's impossible. Something did this." They crested a small rise, and the sight beyond it made them stop in their tracks. A massive clearing stretched before them, littered with skeletal remains of buildings that once stood proud. The remnants were fused with the organic material that seemed to dominate the planet, twisted into grotesque shapes that defied recognition. The air vibrated faintly, and for the first time they saw them. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their movements unnervingly smooth and fluid. At first glance, they looked human, or what had once been human. Their forms were elongated, their limbs too long, and their torsos unnaturally narrow. Their skin was translucent, faintly luminescent, revealing a tangle of writhing organs and veins beneath. Some of them had extra appendages, arms, tentacles, or something in between, that sprouted irregularly from their bodies. Their faces, or what remained of them, were almost featureless, save for hollow, black sockets where eyes should have been. One of the creatures stopped a short distance from the group, tilting its head in an eerily human gesture. A low-frequency hum emanated from it, not audible but felt deep within their bodies, as if their bones themselves were resonating with the sound. "Don't move," Rhett whispered, raising a hand to signal the others. But Malik groaned behind them, his voice low and guttural. His body convulsed violently, and Ilara turned just in time to see him collapse to his knees. His translucent skin had begun to tear, dark tendrils pushing out from beneath. His eyes, now clouded and inhuman, locked onto the creature in the clearing. "They're calling to me," Malik rasped, his voice distorted and alien. "Get away from him," Rhett barked, pulling his weapon. But before he could act, Malik let out a strangled cry and lunged forward. His movements were unnatural, his limbs twisting in ways no human body should. The creature in the clearing responded, extending one of its spindly, multi-jointed arms toward him. The two made contact, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. Malik's body shuddered violently, his form collapsing into a mass of tendrils and translucent flesh. Within moments, he had been absorbed into the creature, his features dissolving into its pulsating form. Kara screamed, stumbling back. "What the hell is this? What are they?" Ilara's stomach churned as she turned to the scanner, but the readings were useless. Erratic spikes of energy and biological markers she couldn't decipher. "They're us," she said, her voice hollow. "Or what we've become." The creature, now larger and more grotesque, let out a low vibration that caused the ground beneath them to ripple. More of the creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms varying wildly. Some were small and spindly, others massive and bloated, with tendrils dragging behind them. "They're converging," Rhett said, his weapon drawn. "We need to move, now." The team turned and ran, their breaths ragged and panicked. The creatures didn't pursue in the traditional sense, but moved in a coordinated way, their forms flowing like liquid shadows to cut off potential escape routes. The terrain shifted underfoot, the pulsing ground making every step feel unstable. Vines writhed and reached out like grasping fingers, slowing their progress. Ilara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The creatures weren't attacking directly, but they were herding them, driving them towards something. A destination. "We're not running blindly," Ilara shouted over the comms. "They're forcing us somewhere." Ahead, the spires loomed closer, their pulsating surfaces casting sickly light over the scene. The vibrations intensified, and the team stumbled into a clearing at the base of one of the structures. Here, the ground was smooth and glistening, as though polished. In the center was a massive, gaping maw, a pit lined with writhing tendrils that stretched into the abyss. The creatures encircled them, their movements synchronized as the low hum became a droning cacophony. Ilara felt her knees buckle, her vision swimming as the sound seemed to burrow into her mind. "This is it," Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where it ends." Rhett raised his weapon, his hand trembling, but before he could fire, one of the creatures stepped forward, its hollow face mere inches from his. Its tendrils reached out, brushing against his helmet. Rhett froze, his body stiffening as his suit's systems flickered and failed. "Ilara," Kara said, her voice rising in panic. "They're not just creatures. They're connected. A hive. We don't stand a chance." Ilara's mind raced as the tendrils from the pit began to move, stretching toward them. Whatever humanity had become in this future, it was no longer bound by individuality or reason. It was a singular, alien force, a living, breathing nightmare. The pit yawned before them, an abyss lined with writhing tendrils that shimmered in the sickly light of the pulsating spires. The air was thick with a droning hum that vibrated in their very bones, a sound too deep to be heard, yet impossible to ignore. Ilara's breaths came shallow and rapid, each inhalation tasting of copper and decay. Around them, the creatures closed in, their elongated forms merging with the shadows like oil slicks on water. Captain Rhett stood at the edge of the pit, his weapon slack in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the tendrils reaching toward him. "It's not just them," he muttered, his voice hollow. "It's the planet. It's everything. We're standing inside something alive." "Rhett," Ilara shouted, but he didn't turn. His eyes were glazed, lost in the mesmerizing undulations of the abyss. She lunged forward and grabbed his arm, yanking him back as one of the tendrils lashed out, brushing against the toe of his boot. The material hissed and bubbled where it made contact. "We're not dying here," she said, her voice fierce despite the panic clawing at her chest. She turned to Kara, who stood trembling, clutching her scanner like a talisman. "We can't fight this, but there has to be another way." Kara's wide eyes darted between Ilara and the encroaching creatures. "Another way?" she said, her voice cracking. "We're surrounded. Malik's gone. The ship's gone. There's nothing left, Ilara, nothing." The creatures shifted, their forms flowing as if in response to Kara's despair. One stepped forward, larger than the rest, its translucent skin revealing a mass of shifting organs that glowed faintly with bioluminescent patterns. Its hollow, eyeless face turned toward them, and the low hum grew louder, sharper, like a tuning fork vibrating at a frequency designed to split minds. Ilara staggered, clutching her head as pain lanced through her skull. Images flooded her vision, fractured glimpses of what this place had been, what it had become. The Earth, ravaged by a cosmic spore cloud that twisted biology into something unrecognizable. The last remnants of humanity, struggling to adapt, succumbing to the inexorable pull of the transformation. The spires, the creatures, the pit, all part of the same grotesque organism that had consumed the planet. "They're showing me," she gasped, falling to her knees. "They're trying to explain." "What do you mean?" Rhett demanded, pulling her to her feet. "What are they explaining?" Ilara's lips trembled as the vision subsided. "It's not malice," she said. "It's survival. They didn't choose this. The spores rewrote them, rewrote everything. They evolved into something that could endure the changes. But the cost was their humanity." Kara let out a broken laugh, tears streaming down her face. "So we're supposed to... what? Join them? Let ourselves become that?" Ilara looked back at the pit, the tendrils shifting and reaching like the fingers of a drowning god. "I don't think we have a choice." But even as she said it, she noticed something beyond the pit, a structure half buried in the fleshy earth, its metallic surface untouched by the organic corruption. It was a stark contrast to the living landscape, its lines sleek and angular, unmistakably human in design. "There," Ilara pointed. "Do you see it? That structure. It's still intact." Kara wiped her eyes, squinting through the haze. "What is it?" "A facility," Ilara said. "Or a lab. If it survived the transformation, maybe something inside can help us." Rhett's eyes narrowed. "Or it's a trap." "Do you have a better idea?" Ilara snapped. "We stay here, we die, or worse. That's our only chance." The creatures didn't move to stop them as they skirted the edge of the pit, their gazes, or whatever passed for gazes, following their progress. The hum subsided slightly, though it remained a constant undercurrent, an omnipresent reminder of the alien intelligence enveloping them. The structure loomed closer, its surface pocked with wear but otherwise pristine. A narrow entrance was partially obscured by the pulsing vines that covered the ground, but Rhett used his weapon to cut through them, the tendrils writhing and retreating as if in pain. Inside, the air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere outside. The interior was a snapshot of the past. Consoles lined the walls, their screens dark but intact. A series of glass chambers stood in the center, filled with a faint, milky fluid. Within them were human figures, unaltered, pristine, their faces peaceful as though in deep sleep. "It's a stasis lab," Ilara breathed, approaching one of the chambers. Her scanner lit up, confirming what she already knew. These people, they were preserved. They never transformed. Kara's voice was barely a whisper. "Then we could—" "No," Ilara interrupted, shaking her head. "The pods are damaged. If we try to use them, we'll die before the process even begins." "Then what's the point?" Rhett asked, his voice hard. "If we can't save ourselves—" "We can save the future," Ilara said, her eyes blazing with determination. She moved to a console and began typing furiously. "If we can activate the temporal beacon, send a signal back to our time, we can warn them. Stop the spores before they ever reach Earth." Kara's breath hitched. "And if they don't listen?" "They'll listen," Ilara said, her voice firm. "They have to." The creatures outside began to gather near the entrance, their forms blending into a single undulating mass. The hum grew louder again, a deep, resonant pulse that rattled the walls. Rhett stood guard, his weapon raised, as Ilara worked frantically to activate the beacon. "Hurry," he said through gritted teeth. "We're running out of time." The console lit up, the beacon emitting a high-pitched tone that cut through the droning hum like a knife. Ilara exhaled in relief, tears streaming down her face. "It's done. The signal's sent." But the creatures were no longer waiting. They surged forward, their mass flooding the entrance like a living tide. Rhett fired, the blasts tearing through the front ranks, but it was a futile effort. The creatures reformed instantly, their tendrils lashing out. "Go!" Rhett shouted, turning to face the onslaught. "I'll hold them off." "Rhett," Ilara started, but he cut her off. "Get Kara out of here. You're the only one who can finish this." Ilara hesitated, but the look in Rhett's eyes left no room for argument. She grabbed Kara's arm, pulling her toward a secondary exit at the back of the structure. As they fled, the last thing she saw was Rhett being engulfed by the creatures, his weapon still firing. The exit led them to a narrow passage that opened onto the landscape beyond. The beacon's tone still echoed faintly, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. But as they ran, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures weren't pursuing them because they had succeeded. They weren't running from the end. They were running from what was beginning.